want to go back, Michael, to Paul Chefurka's
Yes.
model.
Okay, good. So
and so, you know, the sort of 5 stages of awakening that you have adapted from Chefurka, you know, starts with the stage dead asleep, and so you've identified this period of 2000 to 2012 for you as being dead asleep,
correct.
But you were hardly asleep. I mean, you were one of the pioneering voices of the ecological and evolutionary perspective. I mean, you were already on it, and you integrated this new evolutionary perspective during this time. I mean, so say more about Dead Asleep.
Yeah. So first of all, just in case anybody's not heard of Paul Chefurka,
Yeah.
Paul Chefurka is a Canadian. Paul wrote extensively on his website, Approaching the Limits to Growth, from 2008 to November of 2013. And he kind of gave up writing blog posts in 2013 in November because he realized he wasn't going to make a big difference. He had said all he needed to say. And so he just sort of, his handle on Facebook was, or maybe still is, Bodhi Paul Chefurka. Just got into meditating and sort of, and he created something called 5 Stages of Awakening, climbing the ladder of awareness. And the first time I read it, I thought, oh my God, this just maps my experience. So his first stage of awakening, he's got 5 of them: dead asleep, awareness of one fundamental problem, awareness of many problems, awareness of the interconnections between the many problems, and awareness that our predicament encompasses all aspects of life. So in my programs, I like to introduce people. So he has 2 short paragraphs for each of these. So dead asleep. This is Paul Chefurka's language. Problems? Problems? What problems? The only problem is what we're focusing on and telling ourselves. It's all still mostly good and getting better. Hey, just look at technology. You can't stop progress. At this stage, there seem to be no fundamental problems, just shortcomings in human organization, behavior, and morality that can be fixed with proper attention to rulemaking. People at this stage tend to live their lives happily, with occasional outbursts of annoyance around election times or the quarterly corporate earnings seasons. So yes, I had an ecological understanding. I was into bioregionalism and permaculture and ecofeminism and native spirituality, all that stuff in the late 80s, throughout the 90s. But in 1999 or 2000, when I got onto the techno-optimist bandwagon, I lost that ecological grounding. I still had respect for indigenous spirituality and this and that, but I really jumped onto the Jon Stewart, Ken Wilber, Joel DeRosnay, Dwayne Elgin, Evolution Zero sort of trajectory. So that's what I mean by dead asleep. From roughly 2000 until December 3rd of 2012, I was asleep in the sense of I was asleep to the possibility of extinction. I was asleep to the possibility of environmental degradation being like real, because I thought that ultimately it would be transformed into something better and something more positive and everything else. So that's what I mean by dead asleep.
Yeah.
Paul Chefurka,
there was no concern about near-term extinction during that time.
And no real awareness of how pervasive the 6th great extinction was, and how devastating our impact on the water, soil, forests, and life upon which we depend, and just of the biosphere. So I was in denial about all that.
Yeah.
December 3rd, 2012, Connie and I were in Mosca, Colorado, on the slope of Mount Blanca, overlooking Great Sand Dune National Park. We had stayed there several winters, and we were there, and I woke up, and Connie wasn't awake yet, and I saw this article. I think it was in Huffington Post, and it said, it was actually from The Atlantic, 5 climate charts that should have you really, really scared, or something like that. And there was a paragraph and a chart, paragraph and a chart, paragraph and a chart, and then, or maybe vice versa. And then at the end, there was this TEDx talk by David Roberts called Climate Change is Simple. It was a remix. It was somebody had added some music to his TEDx talk. And so I watched it. Brought me to tears. I woke up Connie. I said, Donald, we got something to watch together. We both watched it. We were both in tears. That afternoon or that late morning, I bought Bill McKibben's Earth, James Hansen's Storms of My Grandchildren, Al Gore's The Future, Paul Gilding's The Great Disruption, and one or two other books. And just started immersing myself in the literature of climate change, and all of the challenges that I was in denial about until that day.
So what was it about Robert's talk that got you? I mean, so he was not anybody that any of us knew. I mean, he was a blogger, I think.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In those days, he had no reputation, no credibility. What got you?
Honestly, I think it was as much the slides and the content of his presentation and the conviction with which we spoke, combined with the music and the visuals that Ryan Cooper added. Would I have been as impacted with just watching the TEDx talk in itself without any of the extra music and extra pictures that Ryan Cooper added? That's why the remix is the version I recommend, and that's the one we watched. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I probably would have impacted me, but certainly wouldn't have emotionally impacted me with the same depth, because the music just absolutely was life-changing. And the visuals that Ryan Cooper added beyond just the slides that David Roberts had in his program were life-changing. So anyway, so that was December 3rd, 2012. And then I spent that year studying climate change. And then sometime so awareness of one fundamental problem. Here's what Paul Chefurka says about awareness of one fundamental problem. Whether it's climate change, soil loss, overpopulation, peak oil, chemical pollution, oceanic overfishing, biodiversity collapse, corporatism, economic instability, or socio-political injustice, one problem seems to engage the attention completely. People at this stage tend to become ardent activists for their cause. They may be quite vocal about their particular issue, yet remain relatively blind to any others. So that was really the truth for me. Connie and I got into climate activism, and we went to Salt Lake City and were involved. In fact, we ended up being on the front page of the living section because there was photographers. We did a climate action that ended up being on the Salt Lake City Tribune. So anyway, so very much activism. Climate was the big issue. That was the only thing I was really massively concerned about. I didn't focus on the other stuff. But within 6 to 10 months of that, I started becoming aware, as Chefurka says, is the third stage, awareness of many problems. So dead asleep, awareness of one problem, awareness of many problems. So here's what he says about that. As people let in more evidence from different domains, the awareness of complexity begins to grow. At this point, a person worries about the prioritization of problems in terms of immediacy and degree of impact. People at this stage may become reluctant to acknowledge new problems. For example, someone who's committed to fighting for social justice and against climate change may not recognize the problem of resource depletion. They may feel that the problem space is already too complex, and the addition of any new concerns will only dilute the effort that needs to be focused on solving the highest priority problem. So I don't know about that. That second one wasn't necessarily true for me. I started really getting the many problems, and so then moved in less than a year to what Paul Chefurka talks about as the awareness of the interconnections between the many problems. Yeah. By 2014, I started really realizing that, climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation, species extinction, acidification of the oceans, peak oil, all of this was related. So this awareness of the interconnections between the many problems. Here's what Chefurka says. The realization that a solution in one domain may worsen a problem in another marks the beginning of large-scale system-level thinking. It also marks the transition from thinking of the situation in terms of a set of problems to thinking of it in terms of a predicament. At this point, the possibility that there may not be a solution begins to raise its head. People who arrive at this stage tend to withdraw into tight circles of like-minded people in order to trade insights and deepen their understanding of what's going on. These circles are necessarily small, both because personal dialogue is essential for this depth of exploration, and because there just aren't very many people who have arrived at this level of understanding. So it was sometime between the awareness of many problems and the awareness of the interconnectedness of many problems is when I remember having lunch with you and Carolyn Baker, where I was not willing to, at that time, grant that Guy McPherson might be right or anything close to it. And so I was sort of vehemently saying, no, yes, I respect him and everything else, but I just don't think he gets it. And, I was bringing in John Michael Greer and the long descent and all this kind of stuff. And the two of you were much more like, you just can't dismiss Guy McPherson out of hand, And so that was around that same time. And then the big shift, as big as my embracing evolution, or as big as the shift on the mountaintop outside of Frankfurt, Germany in 1979, as big as the embracing of evolution in 1982, and as big as being introduced to Thomas Berry in 1988, and as big as the awakening to climate in 2012 was late January of 2015. I had been recording dozens and dozens and dozens. Actually, I ended up recording like 400 of John Michael Greer's Archdruid Report posts. And I was recording,
which are never short.
Yeah, no, exactly. And Richard Heinberg and Paul Kingsnorth. And I was just recording all of this amazing stuff related to climate and abrupt climate change and deep sustainability and resource depletion, everything else. And all of these audios are freely available up on SoundCloud, and you can just find them. Grace Limits, I call them my Grace Limits page, and my Grace Limits audio, Michael Dowd Grace Limits, you'll find there. But I was reading aloud to Connie a post that John Michael had written in November of 2011 called A Gathering of the Tribe. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned being at a peak oil conference, an ASPO conference. And he said, I had dinner with William Catton. And he said, I tried my hardest to not be a 14-year-old in the presence of a rock star. And my jaw dropped. Mm-hmm. And I looked at Connie, who was on the couch listening to me, and her eyes got big. My eyes got big. And we both had the same thought at the same time, which is, there's nobody in the friggin' planet that we hold in higher esteem than John Michael Greer. Whoever he's holding up like that, we got to read.
Yeah.
And so I ordered William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change, that day. And it arrived 2 days later, Amazon Prime. And I started reading it. And we were in Florida at the time. We were actually staying with some dear friends, Hart Phoenix and her husband, Jeffrey. And I realized I'm never going to be the same. 12 pages, 15 pages into the book, I knew that when I go to my grave, this was going to be one of the top books, if not the most important book I'd ever read in my life. And the next day, we went to Braun Taylor. Braun Taylor is the author of Dark Green Religion, and he also wrote a book on Avatar spirituality. He's an amazing guy, but he's the director, a PhD program, the first doctoral program in the United States on religion and ecology at the University of Florida, Gainesville. And he's been a dear friend and colleague for years. And so we went to his house, and he saw me in his kitchen. I'm reading William Catton's Overshoot, and he says, "Oh my God, you're reading Overshoot." He said, Dave Foreman, who founded Earth First, gave me a copy of Catton, and he said it was the best book he'd ever read in his life. And I said, that's exactly the way I'm feeling. And he said, well, did you hear he just died last week? I said, what? I went online, the Wikipedia page, nothing. I went on the comments section of the Wikipedia page, and somebody said that they had heard that he died, but they couldn't substantiate it, so they couldn't change the date on his Wikipedia page. And I'm thinking, that was like a week and a half earlier. I'm thinking, how the hell is this possible? Somebody so substantial, the father of environmental sociology. Derek Jensen considers it the most important book of the 20th century. Paul Ehrlich considers it the most important book of the 20th century. Bill Reese considers it one of the most important books of the 20th century. It's like, how could such a substantial author, no obituary, nothing in the New York Times, nothing anywhere? And so I searched all over, and I found out that his grandson is a meteorologist and a physicist in New Zealand. And so I calculated the time zone difference, and I Skyped him middle of the day, and he answered the phone. And I said, I'm reading your grandfather's book. It's changing my life. It's the most important book I've ever read. I've heard that he died, but nobody here in the States can validate it, can substantiate it. Is it true? And he said, yes. He said, not only is it true, my grandmother and my grandfather flew from the state of Washington to New Zealand for my wedding. He died 4 days after the wedding.
Wow.
His body is still here. I said, well, that explains why nobody in the States knows about it. I said, would you be willing to write an obituary? Because he had written an article, and I saw he really got the significance of his grandfather's work. And his name was Will. So, William Catton Will. So he went by Will. Yeah. And he said, yeah, he said, let me work on it with my family. Well, it turns out he ended up taking a week to write it, and it was like 6 times too long to farm out as an obituary, for official newspaper. So I ended up creating the official, call it official. I created an obituary on my Huffington Post blog. And I linked, in the meantime, I called John Michael Greer, and I let him know that Catton died. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, I said, normally I would never ask you to do this, but I know that Catton was really significant for you. Would you consider the possibility of writing a tribute post? And he kind of hemmed and hawed, because as you know, he's Asperger's. And he said, well, I really don't sort of do this sort of emotional thing. He said, but you're right. He said, Catton was really significant. He said, I'll think about it. That's all I'll say is I'll think about it. Great. Yeah. I talked to him on a Friday. On Wednesday, he published As Night Closes In, which is this amazing, heartful, incredible tribute to William Catton. And he says in the first sentence, I was contacted by a fellow author. I learned that William Catton just died. And those of you that, have been with me for some time know that, I keep recommending his book, Overshoot. And he said, those of you that don't, now you know where at least half my ideas have come from. And then he went on to write this incredible post. Now, of course, 50, 60,000 people every Wednesday were reading John Michael Greer. So the next day, Kurt Cobb came out with a thing. Richard Heinberg wrote a post. Thanks, Bill. Everybody started, Ugo Bardi, everybody started coming in with these tributes to William Catton. And I started collecting them, and then Connie created a tribute page for William Catton, where we have all these quotes and some of his videos and his interviews and everything else. And then I called the publisher, University of Illinois Press. And I let them know that he died. Well, it turns out they were in the process of trying to contact him because they wanted to get his permission to create an audiobook and a Kindle version. So I said, well, I'm going to create my own audiobook version. I'm going to record it myself. But if you want to put me in a studio and do it professionally, I don't want any money. I'll do it pro bono, but I'm going to just want to let you know, I'm not going to wait for you to make that decision. I'm going to create a version myself anyway. So they were fine. They gave me permission to do that, which I did. And they ended up actually hiring a professional actor. So there's 2 versions of Catton's Overshoot. There's my version, which is like 14 hours long because I keep repeating great paragraphs, and I've sometimes moved to tears by his generosity of soul and stuff. And then there's the 11.5-hour version, which is created by this professional actor. And everybody that I know that's listened to both said they like my version better. But at any rate, it's getting the book out in audio form. Yeah. And so at any rate, so from that time, that's really when I entered Paul Chefurka's 5th stage. And I want to read that. Yeah, awareness that our predicament encompasses all aspects of life. This includes everything we do, how we do it, all our relations, and our treatment of the biosphere and the planet. With this realization, the floodgates open, and no problem is exempt from consideration or acceptance. The very concept of a capital S solution is seen through and cast aside as a waste of effort. For those who arrive at stage 5, there's real risk that depression will set in. After all, we've learned throughout our lives that our hope for tomorrow lies in our ability to solve problems today. When no amount of human cleverness appears able to solve our predicament, The possibility of hope can vanish like the light of a candle flame, to be replaced by the suffocating darkness of despair. And then I conclude by saying a big picture view of reality and an inner or outer post-doom practice are vital. And that's really, I've devoted my life ever since then to what I'm calling post-doom. And people can go to postdoom.com. I've got 3 definitions of doom. I've got 3 definitions of post-doom that I've actually spent about a year, not exactly a year, 9 or 10 months getting feedback from other friends and scholars and, colleagues. So these definitions of doom and post-doom reflect collective intelligence. They're not just Michael Dowd, but they're pretty good. And that's what I've devoted myself to having conversations, recording these podcasts in post-doom. And really, in some ways, I just recently started calling myself Catton's bulldog, because in the same way that that Huxley was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, I feel like I'm carrying the legacy and trying to get as many people as possible to experience the generosity of soul and the paradigm shift that William Catton's Overshoot provides.
So I think I really became aware of Catton, read Overshoot as a result of the documentary film, What a Way to Go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that documentary, What a Way to Go, Life at the End of Empire.
Who's the producer? His name escapes me at the moment.
T something. I don't remember, but
I'll have to put it back in. But that's where I became. So here's my question for you here. This uncomfortable question. So Overshoot was published in 1980.
Right.
So why didn't I know about this a long time ago?
I say this to my shame, or just my embarrassment. Let's just say that. The second time that I was with Thomas Berry, it would have been 1989, I believe, fall of 1989. I even brought my sleeping bag and I slept outside of his house. He dedicated The Dream of the Earth, his book, The Dream of the Earth, to the great red oak under whose sheltering branches this book was written. Outside his house, like right outside his house, like 12 feet from the house, was this 500-year-old red oak tree. Yeah. And so I slept outside under the red oak and I gathered acorns, and it was just amazing. But while I was there, when we were talking inside, we were talking about something related to carrying capacity or whatever. Oh. And he went to his shelf because he had this incredible library. He pulled off Catton's Overshoot and he actually recommended it to me and he set it down. And I never followed up with it. I never read it. That was 1989.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then, others of that stature, William Ophuls and his amazing writings, just Ophuls, William Ophuls. And I've recorded 4 of his books. Walter Youngquist. I mean, these are the sort of the saints, the sages of this deeply ecological, materials-based, like I love Walter Youngquist. The subtitle of his book, Geodestinies, is The Control of Earth's Resources Over Nations and Individuals. This is great. And William Ophuls brings the ecological paradigm. In fact, Ophuls had an influence on Catton, I found out years later. But William Ophuls brings the ecological paradigm to governance and politics. I mean, if we mimic the wisdom of ecology for how we govern ourselves, how we do politics, William Ophuls is the best guy in the English language for that. These are just some of my significant intellectual mentors, in addition to people I've already mentioned: Thomas Berry, Joanna Macy, Dolores LaChapelle was a deep ecologist.
So, couple of questions that I want to come back to. I'm looking for in my notes here, which are so scattered I can no longer find what I'm looking for. So you've said that your mission is fostering fidelity to the future.
Right.
So what does it really mean to foster or to be faithful to the future? What does that really mean?
I'm so grateful you asked that question, Michael. So I would start by saying that that's what unites truly indigenous or truly sustainable cultures. Sustainable cultures are faithful to the past, faithful to the ancestors, faithful to the future, faithful to the descendants. This whole notion of acting in the present with the seventh generation in mind isn't just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil. To do otherwise is inherently unsustainable. So it's acting with fidelity, being faithful to the past, the ancestors, faithful to the future, to the descendants, and faithful to what we would call Gaia, to the body of life upon which we depend, the biosphere, the ecosphere, but not the ecosphere as the environment, when we think of it as just resources or a place for our waste, but as Gaia or God. I've started spelling God, capital G, O, the earth. So the earth emoji is the O, and then D. So any concept of God that doesn't include Gaia, that doesn't include the living planet as God, reality's local living presence, is a trivial ecocidal notion of the divine. So, however, it doesn't matter the name, except that the name does matter, because what we name primary reality, that is our material creator, sustainer, and end, either lends itself to a humble relationship to that reality or a hubris relationship. And if we think that we are nature's masters, I believe that the most ecocidal thought form in humans' history is this idea of man, conqueror of nature.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Or conqueror of other men.
Or conqueror of other men. Yeah, exactly. That whole domination mindset where it's power over the domination of nature, domination of women, domination of each other. I mean, the whole Andy Schmuckler's whole parable of the tribes, which really ought to be parable of the civilizations, because tribes don't typically act this way. But this idea that once you get the mining of metals and this domination mindset, if you're within reach of a culture that has that, you've either got to develop that mindset to protect yourself or get taken over or whatever. So it ends up becoming almost an evolutionary arms race that I think quite possibly once any group of people in the world went down that path and created an evolutionary arms race in terms of better technology, better weapons and whatever, and more dominant mindset, we would end up in the world that we're now in, where we have raped the living world. We're molesting the future. We are toxifying the air, water, soil, and life upon which we and other species depend, and we call it progress. That's the insane part. I did a 20-minute video a few years ago called Sane versus Insane Progress. The idea that you can have human progress when that progress is dependent upon the degradation of everything we depend upon is just insane. So
that's the fallacy of Stewart's approach. The era of evolution. Because it is perpetual progress writ large.
Correct. And perpetual, that's the thing. When you look at the way, I've got two quotes that I use in my programs, one from William Catton and the other from Thomas Berry. And they are absolutely fundamentally essential for understanding our times. I just want to pull them up here. You'll need to edit this in or whatever. But William Catton says, human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. And then Thomas Berry, along similar lines, says the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. And so that sense of our profound interdependence, interrelatedness, and the idea that we are the masters of nature and that human progress that doesn't factor in the well-being of the living world. That's why I find essential. One of the videos I'm most proud of that I've created in recent years is called Sustainability 101.
Yeah.
Indigenuity is not optional, because what I mean by indigenuity is having a native heart and mind. You don't have to have native blood, but having a native, an I thou, personal, humble, respectful, reverential relationship to primary reality, to the biosphere, to the ecosphere. And that's why I love Teddy Goldsmith, Edward Goldsmith, who was the publisher and the editor of The Ecologist magazine for close to 40 years. And he wrote two amazing books, one of them called The Stable Society, where he took 400 years of anthropological evidence research and said, what are the fundamental differences between sustainable cultures and unsustainable civilizations? And he teased those out. And then his magnum opus called The Way, an Ecological Worldview. And so Teddy Goldsmith, and then Richard Adrian Reese has a book in process. He has the whole thing available on his blog, What is Sustainable. The book itself is called Wild, Free, and Happy. It's Richard Adrian Reese, Rick Reese, Wild, Free, and Happy. I've recorded the entire thing, so both the text available and the audio are available. But Rick Reese and Teddy Goldsmith are the two scholars that I say are essential for truly understanding genuine sustainability. Because if you go to the Wikipedia page and you look up sustainability, they start with civilization. Civilization is the definition of unsustainable.
Yeah, right.
So it's crazy. So back to the questions you asked, which is, what does it mean to be faithful to the future?
Yeah, that word faithful. I want to unpack what that means to be faithful.
Well, first of all,
let me give you a little bit of context for that, because in the whole conversation that is happening around the world about existential risk and the possibility of extinction or the equivalent, meaning that humanity's potential is curtailed, there is very, very little being said about ethics and morality.
Correct.
So what I'm looking for here is, from your perspective, this very long trajectory of pursuing these things, from your childhood, what is the basis for morality given our predicament?
This is a fabulous question, because I don't think it's possible, given the human brain individually and collectively, including the internet, in the 21st century. I don't think it's possible for us to genuinely have a sustainable ethic, a morality that leads us to do the right things, a morality and an ethical grounding that helps us live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, inescapably real, including Gaia. I don't think it's going to happen unless we have a personal relationship, unless we relate personally. And that's the thing that most people, including most atheists, just don't get. And most religious people, is that gods and goddesses aren't supernatural entities. They're personifications of various aspects of our inner and outer reality. So Sol, S-O-L, or Helios, wasn't the god of the sun or the spirit of the sun, but Sol, or Helios, was, for the Greeks and the Hebrews, the Greeks and the Romans, a personification of this fundamental life-giving ball of light and flame that gives us life. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personification of earth. Helios, all the different, Poseidon was a personification of the oceans, not the spirit of the ocean. So Western anthropology has done indigenous cultures worldwide a tremendous disservice by thinking of their personal relationship with the forests, the trees, the rivers, as believing in spirits. Yeah, if you take literally the language, it sounds like that. But what that language did is it facilitated a relationship with the forests, a relationship with the trees, a relationship with that tree, a relationship with that river, a relationship with that sun, that moon. And so because of our brains, the nature of our primate, mammalian, hominid brains, We don't relate respectfully. We don't relate faithfully. We don't even know how to make sense of the word fidelity or faithfulness.
Yeah.
We we're not faithful to a computer. We're not faithful to a lawnmower. We're not faithful to things that we think of as things. We can be faithful to a dog, or faithful to a elephant, or faithful to another human, because it's a living being. We attribute agency, we respect. And so I think it's fundamental to relate to time and nature personally. And that's where the grounding of ethics. So fidelity to the future is doing anything that I can to be a contribution to the future, even if our species goes extinct. So from a personal standpoint, that means lessening my footprint. It means living more lightly. It means attending to the quality of my relationships to the air, water, soil, and life of my bioregion, to my neighbors, having the best quality of relationship to my neighbors that I can, and to my family that I can, because the poop's coming down the pike. I mean, things are collapsing. And so putting myself in a position where I enthusiastically share my worldview with those who seem ready to hear it. I don't foster it on anybody or foist it upon anybody that's not ready for it. And I develop friendly, all my neighbors here, I've got a card up here with everybody's name, all my neighbors and stuff, because I want the best possible relationship. Because as the shit hits the fan and as the hard times become harder, I want there to be good feeling, a sense of rapport, a sense of relatedness. And Connie and I, whenever we go to forests or streams or rivers or mountains or whatever, we freely personify. That is, we give human characteristics to what's ultimately more than human or other than human. And so we sing to great soul every morning. What you call the sun, what most people call the sun, we go out on the porch, and in the morning we sing, hi, hi, great soul, we love you so. And then at night, bye, bye, great soul. So we sing to the rising and the setting of the sun. Mm-hmm. Our relationship is Jasmine. There's Connie, there's Michael, and Jasmine is the mythic personification that we've given to us, or to we. So sometimes it's clear that what Connie wants to do and what Michael wants to do. But when one of us asks, what does Jasmine want? It allows me to, as a man, to think differently. And ultimately I can go with something she might have suggested in the first place, but I don't feel like she's won and I've lost. Nora is our personification of North America. So what most North Americans call North America, we call Nora. And it's just a personification, but it gives us a yummy, more personal relationship to this continent than if we related to it as an it rather than a thou. So anytime that we can in language relate to the past as thou, relate to the future as thou, relate to Gaia as thou, relate to anything, our relationship as thou, it tends to facilitate the kind of language that fidelity makes sense, being faithful. What does it mean to be faithful to this continent? What does it mean to be faithful to our relationship? What does it mean to be faithful to great soul? What does it mean? So that's what I mean by fidelity. And unfaithfulness, infidelity, is to merely use for one's benefit, irrespective of its impact on that other. And so that instrumental mentality, that use mentality, that thinking of the biosphere as merely resources and a place for our waste, is to be unfaithful to the future. And I think all indigenous cultures had a sense of fidelity to time, fidelity to the past, the ancestors, fidelity to the future, and fidelity to the body of life as their larger body, the creator, is essential. So that's what I mean when I say I'm trying to foster fidelity. And that's why Connie's assisting trees in migrating. That's her attempt to be faithful to the future, even if we go extinct this century. My trying to encourage people to say, we need to cap the nukes. We need to get these spent fuel rods out of the fuel, out of the pools, is because we can't assume industrial civilization has everlasting life. If we do, we'll have dozens of nuclear meltdowns. If we know that industrial civilization does not have eternal life, and in fact is on its way down, then we will begin to do the things we need to do to preserve and to make sure that there's as few nuclear meltdowns as possible. There's going to be some, but if we have 5 nuclear meltdowns in the next 100 years or 105, that's a huge difference in terms of our impact in the future.
So part of what I'm getting in listening to this conversation going on around extinction and existential risk is that there seems to be and this is unspoken, but underneath there is a growing belief that there is no future to be faithful to.
Right.
So if that is your unconscious belief, then all bets are off. Well, and you can do anything you want, and there is zero basis for morality.
You've nailed it. And that's the fundamental difference between an ecocentric worldview or a God-centered, but the O in the God is the earth, Gaia-centric, whatever you want to call it. But a life-centered worldview basically says it's not human-centered, but a human-centered worldview, an anthropocentric worldview, says there's no future.
Yeah.
Who the hell cares? Let's just live it up. There's no sense of morality, no sense of ethics, no sense of responsibility to the future, no sense of integrity, right relationship, and integrity of the kind that Christ and other the Buddha and others, it's all about sacrifice, self-sacrifice. Mm-hmm. William Catton, in his book Overshoot, he's got this incredible line. It's really the heart of the book. One of the things he says, mankind, of course, he wrote this in 1980. He would have probably said humankind now, but he said, mankind is locked into stealing ravenously from the future. That's what this book is about.
Yeah.
Human self-restraint, practiced both individually and especially collectively, is our indispensable hope. That's where the grounding for morality and ethics, it's got to be in self-restraint. It's got to be what the sacred principle of enoughness. I just wrote something this morning. Humanity or Homo colossus, industrial Homo colossus, is suffering from a self-inflicted terminal disease. The name of that disease, more.
Yeah.
And our only hope of salvation, and by salvation, I mean redemption. I don't mean necessarily that we're going to make it, but that we can play a redemptive role. All regenerative agriculture, permaculture, anything that we do to participate with the rhythms and patterns of nature and help build and protect topsoil, to help protect and support other species in making this bottleneck, all the things we do on behalf of life, whether we go extinct or not, is irrelevant. Everything we do is holy, holy work. And I think that's really that's being faithful to the future, is regardless of how bad things get, including the possibility of near-term human extinction, there are things that we can do: building topsoil, planting trees, nurturing community, helping to preserve, bioregions and restore damaged ecosystems. There's a lot that we can do that's holy work and that's faithful to the future.